had a dream which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and went, and came, and brought no day, and all hearts were chilled into a selfish prayer for light, and men were gathered round their blazing homes to look once more into each other's face. Happy were those who dwelt within the eye of the volcanoes and their mountain torch. A fearful hope was all the world contained. Forests were set on fire, but hour by hour they fell and faded, and the crackling trunks extinguished with a crash, and all was black.
It was the disaster that shook the 1930s. One of America's finest and newest ocean liners had set to sea. Aboard were hundreds of holidaymakers and families, newlyweds and businessmen, all coming back from Cuba. The voyage had been routine, fun, but then a shock. The captain, a well-liked veteran of the sea, died suddenly just before his ship found itself engulfed in a massive storm. And then, the next day, came the smell of smoke. With shocking ferocity, the SS Morro Castle was consumed by a fire that ate its beautiful wood panelling and completely overwhelmed its beleaguered crew. Those left with no chance of escape faced two choices: jump or burn. On a popular holiday beach appeared the blackened hulk of the ship, and an incredulous public looked on with morbid curiosity even as the Morro Castle's former passengers washed up around the wreck for days and weeks afterward. Initially deemed a tragic accident, the Morro Castle's story passed from the headlines, but soon investigators began to unravel a different story. A story which painted one of the disaster's heroes in a very different light. Today, we're going to wind the clock back 90 years to board the Morro Castle once more. We'll visit the scene of the disaster, retrace the ship's final tragic hours, and speak to experts in the field to unravel this nearly century-old story and determine, once and for all, if this terrible accident really was an accident at all. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. This is the terrifying true story of the SS Morro Castle.
I'm on my way to Cuba, that's where I'm going. Cuba, that's where I'm staying.
1930s Havana. For years, American tourists had flocked to the Cuban capital, where the exotic climate and rich culture had long been a draw. Then, with Prohibition, tourism boomed as thirsty Americans flocked for a drink. But beneath that happy facade, trouble was brewing. The Great Depression saw unhappiness come to a head. Violence erupted, and terrorist groups conducted bombings across Cuba. In 1933, President Machado was forced into exile, and a tug of war for control of the nation erupted. But even so, Americans streamed ashore, excited to spend their dollars on a carefree holiday in the sun, and many of them were taken there by the Ward Line and their ship, Morro Castle.
Wonderful trip to Havana. Hop on a ship and I'll see you in CUBA.
Mostly forgotten about today, the Ward Line was once a giant of the US East Coast, America's self-proclaimed oldest shipping line. It could trace its origins back to 1841, a humble beginning when James Otis Ward established a freight company. 4 decades later, it traded under the name of New York and Cuba Mail Steamship Company, clearly outlining the market it wanted to corner. By the turn of the century, Ward Line had bought out their competition and operated a virtual monopoly on passenger and freight services between New York, Mexico, and most importantly, Cuba. So associated was Ward Line with Cuba that to many, the two were synonymous. In fact, Ward's first ever steamship had even been named Cuba. Into the 1910s, the line went from strength to strength, building a succession of increasingly impressive steamships and making one of the finest reputations for safety at sea. Even during the First World War, the line seemed blessed. All of its ships survived the conflict, with its 2 stars, Havana and Saratoga, serving as hospital ships. Even then, before the war, Cuba had been a winter escape for many fortunate Americans seeking to get away from New York's freezing blizzards, but it was after the war that things really took off. A surge in the price of sugar saw Havana suddenly become one of the world's most important ports, and Ward Line was there to lap up the spoils. The company financed the construction of a new concrete dock system, which would see monstrous volumes of sugar taken from the island, virtually all aboard Ward Line ships at great profit. But while goods and freight made Ward Line the majority of its fortune, of course it was prohibition and the human cargo it provided that saw the line make happy profits too, because there was no end of weary American travellers keen to steam south for a few days to escape the drudgery of the United States without alcohol. In Havana there was cigars, dancing girls, palm trees, and booze. But while Ward Line was the premier line running services to the island nation from its base at the end of Wall Street, in Manhattan's South Street seaport, the company had let its fleet fall into disrepair. The Ward ships were ailing, old, slow, and doddering, and passengers couldn't help but notice. As the 20s wore on, the company ran into trouble as costs began to skyrocket. It nearly bankrupted them, but then the US government came to their assistance. Maintaining a mail link with Cuba was in the American government's interests. It wouldn't do to see Ward Line crumble. In fact, the state of the US Merchant Marine was a shambles, and Congress knew it. It passed the 1928 Merchant Marine Act that injected hundreds of millions of dollars into shipbuilding. Ward Line jumped at the opportunity and had plans drawn up for 2 new, modern sister ships that would see the company into a whole new era. One would be named for the eastern province of Cuba, Oriente, but the other would be named for the castle that had guarded the entrance to Havana's harbour since the 16th century. The Spanish had called it Castillo de los Tres Reyes Magos del Morro, but everyone knew it as the Morro Castle. At the time, the SS Morro Castle was lauded for its modernity. It represented the very best of American shipbuilding, and nearly everything about it was designed to be cutting edge. For the Ward Line, she represented an enormous step forward into a new technological era. She'd been built by the experienced and well-regarded Newport News Shipbuilding Company, launched in March 1930 and finished for trials just 5 months later. She was 480 feet, some 146 metres long, and around 11,520 gross registered tons. She wouldn't be breaking any size records, but what she lacked for in size, she more than made up for in amenities and technology. Inside the hull was packed a set of modern turbo-electric engines. Steam, made from burning fuel oil in boilers, was fed at high pressure into turbines. The turbines span, and like giant dynamos generated enormous amounts of electricity. This was fed into powerful motors, 2 of them, which each drove a propeller. The arrangement meant Morro Castle and Oriente were both very efficient and decently quick, with a service speed of some 20 knots. For the service to Havana, this was blistering. The sisters set a record, and one of them could get to Cuba in just 58 hours, 40 minutes. Ward Line's timing had been superb. In 1929, the US stock market crashed, but the company had managed to build 2 new modern ships that would help see them through the worst of it. Morro Castle set off on her maiden voyage on August 23, 1930, and delighted her passengers and her owners. Until then, Ward Line had only lost 2 ships at sea and never a single passenger in all its years of service. Its reputation for safety was unequalled. Morro Castle and Oriente were meant to continue that tradition, and by the latter part of 1934 they'd done it admirably. On Saturday, September 1st at 4 p.m, the Morro Castle set out as usual from her dock at Pier 13, laden with cargo and cheerful passengers keen to escape the Depression's woes. But while passengers waved excitedly to loved ones ashore, few, if any, could know that all was not well aboard Morro Castle, and that the ship had just 1 week left to live. Surging along at 20 knots, Morro Castle made her way south to Havana, her decks and public rooms alive with excited chatter and laughter. And what gorgeous rooms they were. Ward Line had spared no expense in kitting their pride and joy out with some of the finest public rooms afloat on any American-built ship. Ward's brochures proudly showed off the towering dining saloon with its fine columns and balcony above, the light and airy veranda which served tea and refreshments, the raucous dance deck with the sprawling dance floor and ship-themed bandstand. But perhaps the crowning glory was the first-class lounge. Located nearly perfectly amidships on B-deck, this magnificent room was as lofty as the dining saloon, with carved panels brilliantly varnished along its walls, lavish sofas dotting the sumptuous carpets, an incredibly welcoming room that could be turned easily into a ballroom for a dance. Behind it was the smoking room, suitably masculine, but forward of it were the library and the reading and writing room. The writing room was lighter than the lounge, with fine white-panelled walls and gorgeous curtains hugging windows that ran nearly the height of the entire deck. Here, passengers could while away the hours reading or reporting home on postcards. The cabinet at one end held an impressive array of books that could be loaned for the voyage. This was early 1930s comfort at its very best, and the Ward Line made sure to use full-colour illustrations to lure prospective passengers aboard, and aboard they came, an assortment of characters all keen to enjoy what Morro Castle had to offer. It was no secret that the Great Depression had done enormous damage to American business, especially at sea. Fare numbers dropped off enormously. Cargo and mail contracts kept the line afloat, but Oriente and Morro Castle sailed back and forth every week, with one of the ships leaving New York every Saturday and the other leaving Cuba every Wednesday. Passengers needed to come along to keep the entire operation going, but with a crippling financial crisis well underway, few had cash to spare. The Ward Line began to offer bargain cruises that tempted even middle-class families into coming along for a holiday that would prove to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. For just $65, less than the average month's wage, passengers could board at New York for a cruise to sunny, exotic Havana. The trip was billed as a 6.5-day return voyage. Crucially, passengers were promised 2 days and 1 night in Cuba. It was an alluring deal. Some could even afford the more expensive offers, 10-day or even 2-week-long holidays. With the two ships running back and forth every few days, passengers could stay in Havana at fine hotels, which the Ward Line could organise for minimal cost, all while enjoying line-organised sightseeing tours and trips. Passengers were promised deck games and activities of all kinds, races, gala dinners. In the dance deck, nightly entertainment began at 9 p.m. There was even a dedicated cruise director. There was a gymnasium, a barbershop, even underage passengers were catered to with their own playroom. Morro Castle and Oriente were floating pleasure palaces, and tickets sold despite the fact Morro Castle's mother nation was going through the toughest financial slump it had ever faced. For many, the temptation of Ward Line's cruise deals just proved unavoidable, and they stepped aboard wide-eyed at their luxurious surroundings. As Morro Castle slipped out of New York and into the Atlantic, passengers settled into their comfortable surroundings and got to know their ship. The first few days always proved rigid and formal, but the last few days of the voyage, especially the return, saw the most partying. But even so, as passengers danced the nights away or slept in the sun on deck, the happy facade of the ship hid some dark secrets that holidaymakers were blissfully unaware of. On the bridge stood Captain Robert R. Wilmont, a stout Englishman with 3 decades of ocean-going experience. He presided over his ship with an immense, almost tangible sense of pride, and whether other captains shied away from the more social aspects of their role as ambassador for the line, Wilmont revelled in socialising with his passengers, giving tours of his ship, and keeping dinner tables enthralled with his tales of life at sea. He was so beloved by Ward Line's regulars that many chose to delay their voyages until they knew for certain that he would be aboard, and even though he was offered jobs with other lines, he chose to stay with Ward, a company man through and through. But Captain Wilmot's pleasant exterior belied some uncomfortable facts. First and foremost was his reluctance to conduct emergency drills. He was always hyper-aware of his passengers' sentiments, so much so he thought drills might unnecessarily panic them. When one passenger slipped on a leaking fire hydrant, he had it capped. In other cases, he turned off his ship's state-of-the-art smoke detection system in case it was accidentally triggered by smoke-emitting cargo or cigars. This skirted protocols, but so long as his passengers were happy, he was content. His crew was another thing entirely. The Morro Castle may have been the darling of the ward line and the American merchant marine, but she was very far from being a happy ship. Ships are strange places. They are, for their crews, both a workplace and a home. The kinds of politics, bickering and resentment that can arise in any job place can fester and intensify at sea to unprecedented levels. Captain Wilmont presented a facade of easygoing coolness. His ship looked to be running like clockwork. But the sad truth is that the crew members were poorly paid, extremely discontent, and ruled over by the ward line with cruel indifference. Many jumped ship. It left the Morro Castle, with its grueling weekly schedule, understaffed. The crew who remained worked overtime to double up their workload for a tiny extra pay. With the depression in full swing and wages pathetically low, as little as $30 per month at a time when the national average was around $100, times were tough, and discontent turned to desperation. But there, at the other end of the voyage, was Cuba and opportunity. Some seized it. Morro Castle's cargo typically consisted of the usual goods, Cuban sugar, amongst other banal things, but the cash-strapped crew began to take on unsanctioned goods. Marijuana. It was grown in patches around Havana's streets, then heroin and cocaine to peddle back in New York. Then there was the booze. Cuban rum fetched a premium back in Prohibition-era USA, and sure enough, cases and cases of the stuff found their way aboard the ward line's sister ships. But so too did weapons. Firearms and explosives were routinely shipped between New York and Havana, but always off the books. And then there were people. Even though it was gripped by the Depression, America still stood as the land of opportunity for many in Latin America. To find passage into the United States, in the wake of a new immigration quota set by a 1924 act, seemed nearly impossible, and some found illegitimate ways of doing it. Morro Castle frequently sailed badly underbooked. With so many empty cabins, it was easy for crew members to make a buck smuggling Cubans back into the States, literally locking them into unused cabins for the 3-day-long voyage. It was a dirty business, but times were tough, and the old law of supply and demand reigned. Beneath the feet of Morro Castle's excited honeymooners and retirees were huddled Cuban refugees, desperate mothers, children, and students fleeing the violent unrest of their mother nation. The crew was unhappy. The situation aboard verging on volatile, and overseeing all of it was Captain Wilmot. But instead of dealing with it, he glossed over the issues as easily as his crew painted over rust with gleaming white paint. Morro Castle steamed on for Havana, but it was the last time she'd ever see her home port again. After just a few short days sailing, Morro Castle steamed past the fortification which had given her her name. It was the entrance to the port of Havana. For passengers, it carried the prospect of some exciting time off. With the ship tied up at the pier, they stepped off to explore this new and exciting land, but behind remained the crew, who now had a good job of unloading and loading cargo and turning down the ship's staterooms for a fresh group of passengers heading back north for New York the next day. Down to the docks they came in their dozens, walking up the gangway, back from a holiday that had thrilled and refreshed them. Nearly a full third of the passengers were members of the Concordia Singing Society, a German group out of New York. Dozens of couples with ties to the group boarded, including policeman Adolf Kostbother and his wife Mary, berthed down on D-deck opposite the Hagedorns, Minnie and Henry. Then there were all the newly married couples like Charles and Selma Filzer, honeymooners from New York. Charles was a tall, handsome 20-something businessman with a pencil moustache that made him look like a movie star. Selma was kind and playful. The pair would often banter in their letters back and forth with one another. When Charles was away on business, once Selma had sent him a postcard from a sunny holiday. "Selma, you wuss," he had written back. It's bad enough sending me a postcard with an alluring picture of a swimming pool and palms without having the effrontery to rub it in. I hope you get a healthy case of prickly heat, or at least a freckled nose. The two had paid for a $225 first-class cruise package, and Oriente had taken them to Cuba. Now Morro Castle would take them home. The Filtzers were far from the only newlyweds aboard. There were the Cohens too, Abraham and Harriet, who'd just been married in late August. Abraham, 31, had once been a sports champion in school but turned his attentions to business. Harriet, meanwhile, 21 years of age, was from a migrant family and worked in the finance branch of a department store. Then there was Paul and Marjorie Giannini, hard-working newlyweds from Brooklyn. He was a dental surgeon who lived above his office. Marjorie had grown up knowing Paul's family. With little money to finance a big Italian wedding, the pair had eloped in secret, and the short $65 cruise deal was the perfect cover for them to escape the ensuing outrage back home. As Morro Castle's passengers found their cabins and settled in, her 231 crew made their own arrangements down below, positioning cargo in the holds and preparing the ship for departure. But here, it's thought that some of them may have taken the opportunity to make a profit, smuggling the usual contraband, drugs, and even people. Desperate Cuban families pleaded with crew to take their children far away to the land of opportunity, where they could be met up with later. It's thought that in the chaos of boarding day, many lone children found their place aboard the ship, down below in cabins with meagre rations for the 3-day voyage. At the other end, the crew member who'd arranged their passage would let them out where they could meet waiting family in New York City. They were locked in for the days to come. Morro Castle, fully loaded with fuel, provisions and people, sat low in the water, but she made steam and her engines thumped, and soon she left Havana behind her, never to return. The return voyages to New York were always the most fun. With holidays coming to an end, passengers cut loose and partied before their return to reality. The mood was festive, and that was in large part thanks to cruise director Bob Smith. If Wilmont was master of the ship, then Smith was master of the fun to be had aboard. With his big smile and his jocular nature, Smith was as popular amongst his passengers as the captain. It was he who organised the sports games, the horse racing, and even sightseeing tours around Havana. Under his purview, passengers could even enjoy a putting green during their days at sea. But Smith was at odds with his captain over another critical activity, life jacket drills. He wanted passengers to be practiced at finding their life jackets, putting them on, and gathering at muster stations. But Wilmont thought excessive drills would panic passengers and put the thought of death at sea, the Titanic, the Lusitania, in their heads in the middle of their carefree voyage. Ever the people pleaser, Wilmont put his passengers' comfort above all else and rejected Smith's idea. "It's safer on the ship," he said, "than at Broadway and 42nd Street." Wilmot got his wish. The 318 passengers certainly enjoyed Wardline's floating pleasure palace. No doubt the newlyweds and the honeymooners mixed and chatted excitedly, danced the nights away. For children especially, the Morro Castle must have seemed absolutely vast in scale. Mervyn Bregstein, 8, was aboard with his father Joseph, a dentist from Brooklyn. But aside from being a fun family holiday, there was a secret purpose to the trip. Joseph had been widowed in early 1933, but now he intended to remarry. It had been an immense trial for both father and son, and Joseph paid for the trip to soften the blow and tell his son the news. As Mervyn explored the ship, Joseph worked up the courage to have the difficult conversation with his son. Then there were the Saintses. Maria Caridad was travelling with her children, but her husband Braulio had stayed behind. She was joined by Marta, 11, Margarita, 8, and Braulio Jr., 13, who had his own cabin. The family travelled relatively often, and they lived well. In 1927, they'd taken a transatlantic voyage on the Olympic. On this voyage, their cabins were on A deck, Morro Castle's boat deck, and they were among the finest the ship had to offer. The orchestra played, the engines rumbled, but on the horizon, a thick grey cloud loomed. A freshening breeze plucked at Captain Wilmot's cap, and his veteran years at sea told him what it meant. A storm, a big one, lay directly ahead. Wind howled and the ship pitched and rolled as it began to encounter bigger and bigger waves. The weather had shifted just as Wilmot knew it would. And inside public rooms and corridors, the Morro Castle's ornate panelling began to creak and groan as the hull bent and flexed. For many, the motion of the ship would have brought the dreaded mal de mer, seasickness. Passengers not used to it were confined to their staterooms to try and ride it out and do their best to ignore the nausea. The captain was complaining of stomach pain too, but it wasn't seasickness. Wilmot was 55 and in seemingly good health, but he began to suffer chest and stomach pains. A captain's job is stressful enough to be sure, but Wilmot's mind must have dwelt on the myriad problems of the ship under his command, the unhappy crew, and the unstable situation in Cuba. He shied away from his passengers, unusual for such a gregarious character, and consulted with the ship's doctor, Van Zyl. If anything were to happen to Wilmot, command would probably pass on to his second-in-command, Chief Officer William Worms. Where Wilmot was a commanding, cheerful presence, Worms was more reserved and bitterly disliked by the crew. His pride may have been stung by the fact that when Wilmot had been absent in the past, command had not passed to Worms, but instead temporary captains had been brought aboard specifically. The crew's dislike of Worms stemmed from his command style. Many of them thought he simply had none, that he lacked the leadership capability that made men like Wilmot natural figures in control of their ship. But still, Worms knew Morro Castle well, and she was in good hands even with the skipper in unusually poor health. As the day wore on, the seas became bigger, and the unmistakable signs of a developing nor'easter threatened to check Morro Castle's headway. On her way into New York, she'd need to battle a strong headwind and heavy seas, but the most modern ship in Wardline's fleet was well equipped to handle it. Bob Smith, the cruise director, was making the final preparations for the farewell party, a raucous tradition on the final night of the voyage, which culminated in a roaring dance contest. It all began with a lavish dinner, but conspicuously absent was Captain Wilmot. His seat at the captain's table was vacant, and the passengers, who so enjoyed his company and even chose to travel specifically with him, were annoyed at the absence. The captain was instead in his cabin, and his steak and vegetable dinner did nothing to settle his stomach. He'd phoned up to ask Dr. Van Zyl to mix him an enema, but then fell silent. His crew left him alone to get over his stomach pain, and the night continued on. Outside, the winds picked up, and by about 7 PM they were screaming at over 30 miles, nearly 50 kilometers per hour. Morro Castle's bow lifted over and surged into wave troughs, but her powerful electric engines meant she should be able to make it into New York with little delay, just as her builders had intended. Chief Officer Worms was at dinner with friends when he got a sudden interruption and shocking news from the bridge. He jumped from the table and made his way topside, where he found Dr. Van Zyl wearing a dark expression on his face. Captain Wilmot was dead. The news was like a gunshot that spread through the ship with alarming speed. It began as a rumour amongst the crew before making the leap, like a wildfire, to the passengers. Except it wasn't a rumour, it was true. The chief engineer had tried to phone Wilmot up to report a boiler issue, but he got no answer. Around 7 PM, the captain was found draped over his bathtub, stone dead, and Dr. Van Zyl had given a cursory pronouncement of acute indigestion. The Wardline's most beloved captain was no more, and with his passing there was left a burning question: who would take his place? With Morro Castle headed into the developing storm, a deft hand was needed to guide the ship through the worst of the weather, but whose? Chief Officer Worms wasted no time in sending an urgent radio message ashore to Wardline officials telling them the news about Wilmot, but it might have been a move more aimed at assuming control of the situation more than anything. Many of the crew favoured Chief Engineer Eben Abbott to take control, but in the end Worms' telegram cemented his authority and he took control of the ship. His first act was to ensure that each officer beneath him was subsequently promoted up one rank to assume the duties of running the ship safely through the storm. But then he turned his attention back to Wilmot. Worms thought it best to maintain the scene where the captain had been found and locked the body in his quarters. Then he called for cruise director Bob Smith. The night's festivities were to be cancelled in deference to the old skipper's passing. Smith took on perhaps the most difficult task he'd yet experienced when he took centre stage in the dining saloon and announced, through a megaphone, the captain's death. The happy mood of the passengers was doused immediately, and Smith went through most of the main public rooms to make his announcement, even going to individual groups and interrupting gently by saying, "I have some sad news." The party was cancelled, but passengers were told the bars would still be staffed. They huddled in small groups and chatted quietly, but many turned in for the night. Overhead, the rain fell in sheets and the Morro Castle groaned under the strain of every big wave. The ship was just hours from home, but she'd be arriving without the supervision of her popular, experienced captain. As the night wore on and the small groups of quiet passengers began to disperse, Worms stayed in quiet vigil on the bridge, watching the big waves break over the ship's bow and intent on seeing the liner into New York. He was achingly tired, and he ignored his crew, who suggested he get some rest. This task, guiding the big ship into New York, was a test of his mettle, and to pull it off would show Wardline that he was indeed captain material. Throughout the ship, as the 7th of September became the 8th and the hours passed by, lights began to be doused in empty public rooms, and stewards cleared tables of glasses and finished cigars. Just after 1:30 a.m, the ship cleared Barnegat Light. New York was a little over 70 miles, or 114 kilometres away. In the smoking room, around 2:45 a.m, a steward, Daniel Campbell, was serving a table of gentlemen who refused to retire for the evening, when he was suddenly interrupted by a passenger who asked if he could smell smoke. It was a funny question to ask in a smoking room, but the passenger said it seemed to be coming instead from the lounge. Campbell could have dismissed the man because passengers raised false alarms all the time, but with little else to do at such a late hour, he followed him into the next room and found, alarmingly, that he was right. Something was burning. He stepped into the reading and writing room, and then he saw it, smoke pouring out from the cracks in the door of a small cabinet. He reached for the handle, but it burnt his hands. He sprang back in pain, and the door swung open. It was like the boiler furnace from a steam locomotive. Hissing and glowing red hot, the inside of the cabinet had been completely consumed by flames, but with the sudden inrush of oxygen, the fire reared and surged, burning a fierce blue-white. Campbell ran for help, and another steward rushed to grab a fire hose. On the bridge, William Worms paced back and forth. He wasn't supposed to be on watch. In fact, Second Officer Clarence Hackney was on the middle watch that early morning. With just a few short hours to go until rounding Sandy Hook Spit and taking on the pilot for New York, Worms was determined to see his ship home. But his ceaseless pacing and his unwarranted presence made the middle watch crew nervous. Then, with a bang, the door to the bridge burst open, and a breathless night watchman barked out a simple warning. "There's a fire!" he roared. Smoke was rising slowly from the mouth of a deck vent which ran straight through down into the public rooms. It was obvious cause for alarm, but Worms took the situation in hand. "Get down there," he said to Second Officer Hackney. "See if there's a fire." Hackney rushed below, fire extinguisher in hand. 50 feet away, near the radio room, wireless operator George Alanya, 21 years old, woke up startled by the sound of rushing feet. The junior radio operator had been on shift and he could smell smoke too. He burst into the cabin where the chief radioman, George Rogers, was asleep and tried to rouse him. As Alanya sat himself down at the set, Rogers pushed him out of the way and took control, tuning the set to the distress frequency, but then he stopped. A distress call required direct authority from the bridge, but attempts to use the phone line proved futile when the line crackled and died. Smoke began to pour into the room. With Rogers sat waiting at the set, Alanya rushed out to the bridge to see what was going on. Down below, passengers were disturbed from their slumber by commotion in the lounge. First-class passenger Doris Wacker had joined friends for a private party in Suite 17, a stateroom which opened directly out onto the lounge's balcony. It gave her a superb view of the room below, normally full of happy passengers, light music and idle chatter. But as she left her friend's cabin to go back to her own, the flicker of light caught her attention. She peered out over the railing and down into the well, where crew struggled with buckets to throw water onto a roaring fire in the writing room. Around the same time, Second Officer Hackney burst into the lounge to see a sight that took his breath away. Flames spread wildly out of the reading and writing room and began to eat the luscious carpet of the lounge. It roared angrily and crackled as varnished timber was consumed with voracious speed. Stewards desperately threw buckets of water onto it, but it was like warding off an angry, charging bull with a spray bottle. The battle to save Morro Castle had begun, but the crew had no idea it was already over. the ship's 318 passengers and 231 crew, a countdown had started that would see their ship consumed completely from stem to stern by flames, a fire that would roar through their ship, cutting off escape routes and trapping dozens where they slept. In the radio room, Chief Operator George Rogers sat patiently, the smoke beginning to sting his nostrils. He was unmoved by the drama and waited quietly for Alanya to return from the bridge with orders from Worms. Through his headset, he heard a message crackle out into the night. It was from a nearby freighter and asked if anybody had information about a ship they'd spotted burning in the darkness. A New Jersey shore station responded that they had no idea, but Rogers stayed quiet. The thought of fire didn't concern him. In fact, he was quite used to dealing with them. And besides, he may have known all about the ship's fire before anyone else. Morro Castle was just miles from home, but she was burning. Policeman Lewis Norris had settled into his long graveyard shift. The midnight to 8 AM stretch was usually very quiet, but that September morning, the wind and the rain howled. Then there came a phone call. The resident had been staring out his bedroom window. Something, he said, was glowing out on the horizon. Norris sped out into the night in his Model T Ford to see for himself. Parked by the seaside, he braved the wind and the rain, and then he saw it. The 21-year-old radio man George Alanya burst out of Morro Castle's radio shack bound for the bridge. He needed to find out what was going on, to speak to Morro Castle's acting captain, William Worms, and to get his okay to send a distress signal. The radio room was situated conveniently close to the bridge, about 50 feet or 15 metres away, but the smoke was so thick Alanya could barely see it all, and it stung his eyes to tears. Something, somewhere, was badly wrong, and Alanya wasn't going to be caught out by a fire in the thick haze. He'd have to find another way to the bridge. Two decks below his feet, stewards fought desperately to keep the flames at bay. They threw bucket after bucket of water onto the roaring fire, but the water simply fizzled into steam. Like an unstoppable tsunami of fire, it spread across the floor of the lounge and, crucially, the walls. Morro Castle, like all ships of her era, made heavy use of ornate wood panelling. It was varnished almost weekly to a near mirror-like sheen. It kept the ship fresh and like new, but it created the perfect fire accelerant. As soon as the walls began to burn, there could be no stopping the inferno. Morro Castle was a steel ship, but nearly every surface inside was covered in thickly varnished timber. It's hard to conceive of something more suited to burning. Second Officer Clarence Hackney stood aghast at what he saw. He'd rushed down from the bridge with a fire extinguisher in his hands, and he sprayed its contents onto the fire, but it too fizzled into nothing. The heat was so intense it was nearly impossible to get close enough to the flames anyway, and even now thick black smoke was curling up towards the lofty ceiling of the lounge and obscuring vision. Hackney already knew that this was a losing battle. He turned and ran for the bridge in a panic, desperate to report the dire situation to acting Captain Worms, but as he did so, he completely forgot to close the steel fire doors that connected the lounge and the writing room to the rest of the ship. The stewards that were throwing buckets of water onto the fire, none of them thought to close the doors either. Staring into the flames must have had a mesmerizing effect, like looking into the eyes of some kind of demon. This was one of nature's most fearsome, unstoppable forces, and standing between it and an entire shipload of sleeping passengers was a handful of white-coated men with buckets. Throughout the ship, passengers still slept, but those closer to the burning writing room were roused by commotion or smoke. Marjorie Giannini woke up by chance. Her stateroom was stuffy, and she woke up to look out of a porthole, but there, in the glass, was flickering orange light. She didn't think much of it, and half asleep, she rolled back over in bed. On the bridge, acting Captain Worms looked intently at his ship's fire indicator panel. Lights corresponded to sectors of the ship's deck, and reassuringly, none of the cabins and rooms around the lounge were yet lit up. But Second Officer Hackney at last returned and made his report, that the situation was fast getting out of control. Worms at last sprang into action. He sounded the general alarm, which rang bells throughout the ship, and sent for the seamen in the forward part of the ship off watch to be woken at once. Then he phoned up the engine room and told the duty crew to get all possible pressure on the main fire pumps. Buckets obviously wouldn't do. If the crew stood any chance of containing this beast of a fire, they needed fire hose and a dedicated assault on the heart of the flames. Chief Engineer Abbott had been roused from his sleep by the commotion and reported at last to the bridge, curiously, dressed immaculately in his dress whites. Worms barked at him to get down to the engine room and make sure that the pumps were well fed with steam. It was like preparing his crew to go into battle. Marjorie Giannini had drifted off to sleep again, but something, maybe the fire alarm which rang weakly out in the corridor, woke her up again. This time, she could definitely smell smoke. She bolted out of bed and woke her husband, Paul, with a start. Even though they hadn't been through an emergency drill, they grabbed their life jackets and put wet towels over their faces. The Brooklyn couple was as ready as they could be to face whatever was out in the hallway. They opened the door to take a look. The fire alarm rang bells in corridors and rooms throughout the ship, but it rang so softly, most slept peacefully through it. Up on A deck, in cabins directly above where the fire raged, passengers slept soundly through the alarms too. The Sains family in their luxury suites probably never heard it at all. Just beneath their beds, crewmen were fighting a desperate struggle to bring the fire under control. Captain Worms stared at the fire indicator panel to get some idea of what was going on down there. If his crew could keep water pressure up, then the ship's fire suppression system, fed by 42 hydrants, should be able to keep the worst of it at bay. But then, his blood ran cold because the indicator panel suddenly began to light red on B deck, and then A deck. It meant that passenger staterooms were catching on fire. At last, Worm's efforts to rouse the rest of the crew were seeing effects. They came in teams, banging pots and pans, rapping their knuckles bloody on doors to wake everybody up that they could. In panic, dressed in their pajamas and dressing gowns, people stumbled out into the smoky corridors without the foggiest idea of what was happening. They grabbed their life jackets and rushed for the boat deck, and slowly a crowd of people began to gather by the boats. But those on the bridge watched in horror as fire unexpectedly burst onto the deck where the boats were swung poised for launch. It nefariously licked at them until boats 2 and 4, closest to the source of the blaze below, began to buckle from the heat, their paint bubbled and peeled. Worms must have had a million thoughts flood his mind. They'd been so close to making it home. To others, he seemed dazed, mentally removed from what was happening around him. But then he was snapped out of his shock by a huge boom and a ball of furious flame that erupted from the side of the ship. Morro Castle had been fitted with a Lyle gun. It was a cannon designed to fire a rescue line to another ship in the event of a hasty evacuation. In the chaos and the confusion, its existence had been forgotten about. That, and its proximity to the fire. The gun was stocked with 100 pounds, nearly 50 kilograms, of gunpowder. With a crack, it went up, blowing out windows and sending fire and debris raining out over the Atlantic. But then there was a gush as air was sucked back in through the new openings it had left behind. It created a draft that whipped through A deck, with devastating results. With Morro Castle's nose pointed into the worst of the wind and the storm, fresh air was being funneled into the ship's vents at near gale force speeds, and one of those vents ran straight through the writing room where the fire was raging. In the 15 or 20 minutes since fire had been detected, Morro Castle had been maintaining a course that was feeding the fire with so much oxygen it burned white hot. In the lounge, at last, stewards were forced back, by an unstoppable wall of flames that singed their hair and their clothes and forced them to step warily away. No longer contained by the lounge, it hungrily swept into the main staircase, and then the passenger corridors, a torrent of fire that flowed like liquid through the wooden maze that made up the accommodations on B and A deck. In just seconds, possible escape routes were cut off by orange tongues of flame and obscured by acrid, toxic smoke that stung the eyes and choked the life from anybody that breathed it. The steady crackle of the fire became a roar as it consumed all the finery, all the beautifully varnished timber, all the tiles and the curtains and the luxury. It had been designed to thrill the ship's passengers, but now it fed a voracious blaze that was quickly gutting the heart of the ship. Worms watched from the bridge in frozen terror as fire burst onto the boat deck and rolled forward, while below it the promenade deck began to burn as well. On the other side of the bulkhead, passengers were sound asleep, but then they were awakened not by alarms or warnings, but by flame as it flickered under their doors and caught their carpets alight. For many, there was just time enough to jump out of bed, comprehend the horror, and look for escape. On A deck, the staterooms had windows that looked out over the boat deck. In A21, Mrs. Caridad Saints and her two daughters woke up in terror as their rooms suddenly caught alight with absolutely no warning. With just seconds to act, Mrs. Saints rushed for the window to get her girls out, but the fire roared and consumed everything in its path. Through the window came one of the Saints' girls, badly burned, but nobody followed after her. The sudden fight for survival for those asleep on A deck came absolutely out of the blue and at a terrifying pace. There were only seconds to act, seconds to live or die. From the boat deck windows came the sounds of screams, and then, one by one, people fell out onto the wooden planks. Angelus Dawn fell onto the deck from her stateroom A16 with her face and her hands burnt and her night clothes smoking, but in her rush to escape, she'd left her pet whippet behind. On the starboard side, at cabin A23, 13-year-old Braulio Saints appeared panicked at his window and tried to squeeze through. Badly burnt, he was pulled through and collapsed to the deck in a smoking heap. Then at A18, there came 13-year-old Bobby Gonzalez, small and lithe enough to squeeze through his stateroom window, but he too was horribly burnt, and he lay still on the deck below the lifeboats, surrounded by a disturbed crowd who had no idea of what to do. Just forward at A10, 41-year-old Max Berliner had no chance of getting through his narrow cabin window, even as the fire spilled into his cabin and began to eat the room. Nearby, in A3, Miss Catherine Cochrane may have never woken up at all. Morro Castle's finest passenger cabins had been reduced to smouldering hell. Across the ship, passengers began to wake and gather in small groups, while just feet away from them, the fire raged. Beneath their feet, the deck began to radiate an intense heat. In the radio room, Chief Operator George Rogers sat awaiting orders. But even then, his inaction seemed odd. Smoke had poured into the little room, and then tongues of flame began to lick at the open porthole and turn the white paint around it black. He'd maintained that a distress signal could only be sent on direct orders from the captain, but radio operator George Alanya had struggled to find his way to the bridge through the thick smoke. Alanya, for his part, had at last made it to the ship's control centre and found acting Captain Worms in a frozen daze. He ran to him and reported that Rogers had sent him for orders. Worms seemed to stare through him. "All right," he said before walking off into a cloud of smoke. Then Alanya noticed that the helmsman was struggling with the ship's wheel to keep her nose into the wind. He began frantically to spin the wheel with absolutely no feedback whatsoever. The steering wasn't responding, and the lines that ran the telemotor down to the steering engine and rudder had been eaten through by the fire. And then, with a snap, the lights on the bridge and throughout the ship cut out for good, and Morro Castle was enveloped in darkness. Down in the engine room, Chief Engineer Abbott and his men struggled with their machinery. The fire pump had steam on it, sure enough, but pressure was dropping alarmingly. Morro Castle had been designed with what was, for the time, an impressive fire suppression system. Aside from the steel doors, there were some 42 hydrants and thousands of feet of fire hoses that could reach anywhere in the ship, but her designers had figured that a serious fire would require no more than 6 hydrants at a time, and the pumps had been designed accordingly. Now, with a fire fanned by storm winds and flames ripping through 3 decks of ornate passenger cabins and public rooms, the crew were forced to fight sporadic battles with their hoses wherever they could. With more than double the amount of hydrants in action that was designed, the pressure across the entire system died virtually to a trickle. Crews, their faces blackened with soot and their skin peeled by the heat, felt the pressure go. The most crucial weapon the men could use to contain the blaze was dying out, and the fire would be able to consume the ship without mercy. Nobody could stop it. Worms, frozen into some kind of inaction on the bridge, at last realised his error. That keeping Morro Castle on her course into the wind had supercharged the fire into a kind of burning hurricane. With the situation well out of his control and critical seconds ticking by, he knew that his ship couldn't make it to New York. That here, miles off the New Jersey coast, he'd need to evacuate the liner, and Wardline's flagship was lost. He'd have to try to get the ship closer to shore so boats could be landed right on the beach. But the liner's steering had died just moments earlier. Now Morro Castle would need to use her engines, with her port propeller running astern and her starboard engine ahead. It would slowly turn her bow to port, westwards, towards the Jersey shore. In the distance, Worms could just see the sea-girt lighthouse. It must have seemed impossibly far away. With her engines thumping, the ship turned sluggishly as she pitched and heaved in the big waves. The battle to save Morro Castle was over, and the evacuation was about to begin. Two decks down from the fire, Charles Filzer, 27, was asleep in his stateroom next to his wife Selma. The pair had been married just a week and a half earlier, and their honeymoon to Cuba had been short but sweet. They'd been photographed there, arms around one another in all white, chic, happy, their whole lives ahead of them. But in the middle of the night, as the ship around him gently rocked and swayed in the big sea, Charles's eyes blinked open in the dark because he could smell smoke. He bolted out of bed, stuck his head out of the cabin door into the hallway, and was hazy. Alarmingly, there was water on the floor. Something was desperately wrong, so he shook his wife gently awake and reached for the life jackets. In other corridors, passengers and crew ran through, banging on doors and dragging people out. The Gianninis had come out with their mouths covered by wet towels to protect against the smoke, and they did their best to rouse their friends and their shipmates from their slumber. For those that stumbled out bleary-eyed into the corridors, the ship's layout and the fire's location presented a simple, brutal problem. The fire had started in the very centre of the ship. It had burnt fiercely up into A deck where the lifeboats were kept. It was so hot that boats 2 and 4 had buckled, caught alight, and then completely fallen off their davits into the ocean below. With the centre of the ship a white-hot inferno, and all connecting corridors and hallways thick with choking smoke, there was simply no way for anybody aft of or behind the lounge to get to A deck where the lifeboats were stored. The boats were designed to be lowered from A deck and boarded by passengers on the deck below at the promenade, but Captain Wilmont had so hated lifeboat drills and the inconvenience they caused for passengers, and now his passengers, who certainly had enjoyed their cruise thanks to Wilmot's consideration, gathered in confused groups towards the stern, their escape routes cut off by fire, and their progress through unburnt areas checked by eye-watering, lung-stinging smoke. Cruise director Bob Smith had been a popular organiser of glitzy gala dinners and fun, sun-drenched deck games, but now he sprang into action as an organiser of terrified, confused people with nowhere to go. He ran through the corridors, some flooded by the fire hoses, banging on doors and getting as many topside as he could. But when he realised paths to A deck were impassable, he gathered over 100 people on C deck towards the stern. He would have made for B deck, but the fire began to eat the aft main staircase and blocked his tattered group of people from the upper decks. With the flames eating the ship from the centre out, Bob knew the stern, one of the extremities of the ship, would be the last to burn. In Morro Castle's radio room, George Rogers sat in darkness, his wireless set's emergency batteries in action, providing the ship with her last tenuous connection to the outside world. As the ship's engines drove her closer to the Jersey shore, the radio waves began to come alive with strange reports of a ship burning somewhere out there on the ocean. But Rogers did not respond, and no distress call was sent. He was adamant he had to wait for orders from the bridge, and Alanya, his assistant, had spent the last half hour running back and forth trying to find the captain and get the orders he needed out of him. At last, Alanya arrived, coughing and choking from the smoke, breathless from his efforts. Worms had finally given his permission. Rogers turned to see Alanya, who gave the okay, and he sprang into action, tapping out Morro Castle position and an SOS. But then there was a thud and a puff of smoke. The emergency batteries had exploded from the heat. It was 3:24 a.m. Morro Castle's one and only distress call had just been sent, but the radio operators had no idea if it had been received or not. On the boat deck, Engineer Abbott, his once pristine white uniform now dotted with embers and stained with black soot, hoarsely shouted for Lifeboat 3 to be swung out and loaded. A small crowd of people, mostly crew, stood and watched as the boat dropped painfully slowly down to deck level. Abbott had been down in the engine room, overseeing his men's efforts before smoke had driven him into a panic. He left them behind as he ran for the bridge to get more orders, but Worms was annoyed by his sudden presence. Instead of sending him back down to the engines, Worms told him to oversee lowering the ship's boat, so now Abbott found himself at the boat deck, but Boat 3 had become stuck. Abbott bawled at the crew to kick the pelican hook, securing it to the deck free, but it wouldn't budge. He and the small crowd of crewmen lost their patience. They left the boat behind and moved up to Boat 1 instead. But then, as that boat swung out, there was a sudden commotion. A young woman appeared at her suite's window, one of those that looked out over the boat deck. The crew smashed the glass and pulled her through just in time as the cabin was consumed by the flames behind her. She was tossed into Lifeboat 1 with 3 other passengers and 27 crew, and sitting among them was Chief Engineer Abbott. The boat lowered away into the pitching, broiling sea, and it left the burning ship behind. On B-deck, at the forward lobby, a ragtag team of crew and passengers used the last of the available water in a vain effort to stem the flames, but the fire roared up the elevator shaft, propelled by an immense draft. Clearly, it had spread to the decks below their feet. The intensity of the blaze meant by around 3:25, the forward and the aft main staircases were impassable. On the bridge, Captain Worms coughed as the smoke swirled and wheeled. The portside boats were nearly totally engulfed in flames, with 2, 4, 6, and 8 burning and buckling. Boat 10 was being struggled with by a small group of crew. It freed and rattled down the hull before plopping into the water with just 2 people aboard, but they couldn't free it from the lines. With Morro Castle still moving through the sea, it was dragged along like a toy, battered and bashed against the steel hull with every big wave. Then, at last, the 2 men got the hooks off and the boat fell behind and disappeared into the darkness. Cruise director Bob Smith had done his duty well. He'd gathered passengers into groups and taken them to the stern of the ship where they stood shivering and drenched from the rain. But with no path through to the boats on the decks above, he was at a loss on what to do with them. He'd stumbled across a life jacket for himself but gave it to another passenger instead. He knew what the passengers didn't, that the fire was consuming the ship from the middle out. It was inching closer towards them with every second, and soon they may be forced to do the unthinkable, to dive overboard into the heaving white-capped abyss below. But as he tortured over the predicament, there came shouts as young Braulio Saints, horribly burnt from his escape from A-deck, was carried to the group by crew members who placed him on the deck, mortified when his skin slipped off in their hands. The boy was at death's door, semi-conscious and whimpering for his mother. A passenger doctor stepped forward to help, but no sooner was he at the boy's side than Braulio Saints breathed his last tortured breath, and the group fell silent. Some were barefooted. They could feel the deck beneath them beginning to warm up. Back at the boat deck, the bulkhead separating A-deck's starboard cabins from the boats managed to contain the fire so crewmen could struggle with the lifeboat's falls and try to get some away. Boat 3 had got stuck when another party came across it and finally managed to free the lines to get it away. On the other side, crew struggled with Boat 12. They could plainly see the flames as they ate the deck ahead of them. Night watchman William Torres, 35, did his best to free the lines securing the boat to the davits, but the fire was too quick for him. If he stayed any longer, he'd burn with the boat. He abandoned it and quickly ran for the other side of the ship. No other boats on the port side made it off, and they burned where they sat. From the bridge, Captain Worms watched as small groups of crew fussed with the few remaining boats on the starboard side. But to his frustration, he saw that those jumping in were mostly crew members, and the passengers were nowhere to be seen. Torres, who had just abandoned Lifeboat 12 on the other side of the ship, now wrestled with the lines for number 11, while Second Officer Clarence Hackney barked orders at groups of crew, but some stood dumbfounded as if they had no idea how to work the boat's gear at all. Others ignored his orders. They were supposed to swing the boats out and wait for passengers to board, but many hopped in themselves and lowered away. The boats, some with only a handful aboard, thrashed down into the water and were battered about by enormous waves as they drifted far away from the burning ship. Worms shouted his voice hoarse from the bridge wing, but it was no use. Nobody could hear him over the gale. Where were the passengers? What he didn't know was that escape routes aft were completely cut off. But then something must have caught his eye. A lone figure bobbing in the waves, a head, and then another. His passengers were there. They were jumping overboard. At the stern rail, cruise director Bob Smith knew that the end had come and passengers were taking it upon themselves to leap into the raging ocean without his direction. He pleaded with them to dive headfirst, but in the blind panic, many ignored him. Life jackets are designed to keep the wearer floating at all costs. They're extremely buoyant. Jumping from a height with a life jacket on could have dire unintended consequences. Morro Castle's passengers climbed over the railings, their shoe soles melting to the deck beneath their feet, and dropped 2 or 3 stories into the black waves. But as many hit the water, their life jackets shot up, clipped them on the chin, and broke their necks, or knocked them unconscious. Standing among the crowd was the Filtzers. For less than half an hour since waking up to the smell of smoke, they'd agonised on what to do, but with the fire now at the group's heels, they realised there was only one option. They climbed the rail together, held hands, and leapt over the side into the darkness. They were joined by fellow honeymooners Marjorie and Paul Giannini. Marjorie noticed, to her horror, that the ship still seemed to be moving, that the propellers were churning a path as they still slowly span with the ship's dying steam supply. Encouraged by Bob Smith, who did his best to warn the group of the danger below, the Gianninis took the plunge. Marjorie was only wearing a negligee and a chemise with a life preserver on, and the cold must have been stunning. In a constant stream, people jumped together or alone, the living trail of terrified holidaymakers, newlyweds, businessmen, and families who tried their best to cling together for survival in the darkness. Young stenographer Alma Hill had only graduated high school 2 years prior and had taken the holiday to Cuba on her own. Now she faced a life or death choice. She glanced at her silver Elgin watch and steeled herself. Beside her was Father Raymond Egan from New York. The handsome 6'4" reverend had suffered that night with his eyes badly swollen from the smoke. Egan went from person to person, group to group, offering consolation and absolution to anybody who wanted it. He came across Alma, who was prepared to jump. He helped her over the railing, away from the propellers, and she leapt over the edge, 35 feet, into the pitching waves below. In the bridge, Captain Worms was struggling for fresh air himself, and he couldn't help but notice that the ship's control centre was becoming insufferably hot. With the remaining lifeboats burning at their davits and his ship blacked out, there was little he could do. He was now nearly as helpless as the burning ship around him. But he did have one final plan, one act that could help save lives. He knew the Jersey Shore was close at hand, but with his ship pitching and rolling in the waves, it was likely she could drift further and further out to sea, where the jumping passengers would stand no chance. Morro Castle had to be held in place, and he knew just the thing for it. He gathered whatever crew he could still find and sent them running forward. If one of Morro Castle's 5-ton anchors could be dropped, it would hold the ship in place long enough for any kind of rescue. With the lashings quickly ripped off and the clutch disengaged, the anchor simply dropped by virtue of gravity. Its chain clattered and roared out of the hawser, and the whole thing disappeared into the black. Below Morro Castle's bow, the flukes dug deep into the soft sea floor and the chain gathered in a thick, heavy pile. The ship was arrested, and now she swung with the wind and the waves. At the stern, the group of passengers was beginning to thin out, and the frantic escape over the side had become a race for survival. Some had been trampled and injured as those around them panicked and made for the railings. In the near distance, they could see small white blurs, the ship's lifeboats, but they were in no position to come to their rescue. The crew in the boats were struggling just not to be capsized by the waves themselves. They disappeared into the night. Some had the bright idea to rig lines down from the ship's stern so those fit enough could lower themselves into the water instead of jumping, but it did little to quell the panic. One tall man stood frozen at the railing, blocking those behind him from going over. They tugged at his shirt, but he wouldn't move. Finally, a woman, in desperation and on the verge of suffocation, bit him, and he reeled away in pain. People stumbled, fell, and toppled over the railing, over one another, in a desperate bid for life. Only a few hundred feet forward, Captain William Worms realised that the end had truly come. If he and his men stayed on the bridge any longer, then the flames would cut off their escape and burn them alive. He ordered a final evacuation, and that the remaining crew and officers should rush forward for the forecastle, the ship's very bow. They staggered, blinded by the acrid, poisonous smoke as it bit their nostrils and flooded their lungs. There were the radio men too, Alanya and Rogers, who had waited at their stations to the last, even though the radio set had died nearly half an hour earlier. Morro Castle's command centre was at last empty, and flames licked and swirled around the machinery that had once commanded her proudly through the waves. The shining brass telegraphs, the big wooden wheel, it was all reduced to charred and twisted ruin as the fire hissed and hungrily consumed. That was it. Morro Castle was dead in the water, mostly abandoned but for the few crew at the bow and those that hadn't yet leapt from the stern. But watching on, incredulously, was the crew of another ship. Andrea Lukenbach, a cargo ship, had been battling north into the storm as well before they received the frantic, curt SOS call, which suddenly cut off. They'd raised all steam to close the 10 miles or so to Morro Castle's position, maybe originally concerned they wouldn't find the ship in the dark, before spotting something as bright as a flare that was lighting up the horizon. When they finally arrived on station, they were greeted by an unforgettable, hellish scene. From stem to stern, the great ocean liner burned like a roaring volcano. People were stuck in staterooms and waved frantically from portholes. One woman waved at her would-be rescuers with her hair aflame. In the water, dozens of people, alive and dead, drifted listlessly, swamped by massive waves and obscured by spray. At the stern, people still jumped in dribs and drabs and fell behind into the night. In a hurry, the crew of the Andrea Lukenbach got their own boats swung out and into the water. Against the odds, the distress call had gone out. It had been received and answered, and help was at hand. Bob Smith realised that the time had come for him to go overboard too. He had watched appalled as those under his care were forced to leap into the ocean. He had set off to try to hunt for stragglers, but his path was completely blocked by flames. Now it was just him, alone, at the sea deck stern railing with no life jacket. He climbed over and jumped. Nearby, Reverend Egan and a handful of others were huddled, the loneliest people in the world, as the ship burned around them. Egan was determined to stay, even though his face was burnt from the intense heat, and he tried his best to calm those that remained and didn't want to jump. Then, from below them, came a shout. A lifeboat had come alongside and was standing too, just off one of the ropes that had been rigged over the side. Rescue had come. The small group slid over the side down into the boat, and Reverend Egan at last escaped the Morro Castle. The lifeboat was not one of the ship's own, but from the SS Monarch of Bermuda. The dazed survivors peered through the spray at the vast white hull of a towering liner. She'd been steaming for New York herself, but turned around instead when reports of the deteriorating situation had reached her wireless. The SS President Cleveland arrived on scene too, although she didn't lower her boats into the water for fear of swamping them. Then the city of Savannah came. She arrived just after Andrea Lukenbach, and her crew went back and forth in their boats, scooping up anybody out of the water that they could. Above them, the sky began to glow a murky purple. Sunrise was just around the corner. The longest night was soon to end, but the faint morning glow cast its light on a pitiable scene. Those in the water had faced hell both before and after jumping. They'd tried to stay together, but broke naturally apart by the howling wind and the punishing waves. The water was cold enough that it sapped many of them of their strength and left them floundering only to disappear beneath. The Filtzers had jumped together, holding hands, and then gripped onto something floating nearby. They quickly discovered, to their terror, that it was the body of a fellow passenger, but with nothing else to keep them above the waves, they had no choice but to cling on. Then there had come a huge rolling wave. It knocked Charles away into the dark, and Selma soon lost consciousness. Alma Hill had been with another group, but she got lost in the surging waves and found herself numb and alone. She struggled bravely, swimming to keep herself warm as best she could, but a passing fishing boat, loaded with victims and survivors, failed to stop to pick her up, and she reached her breaking point. Nearing hysteria, Alma was resigned to her fate and felt like rescue could never come for her. Assistant purser Tom Torreson had tried to help with 13-year-old Bobby Gonzalez, who'd fallen through his A-deck stateroom window when the suites had suddenly been consumed by the fire. The boy was in agony, but Torreson tried his best. The pair went into the water together, and the horrible pain from third-degree burns suddenly plunged into salt water cannot be possibly imagined. Torreson took Gonzalez onto his back and the boy put up a brave fight. But after a while in the water together, Torreson realised Bobby wasn't responding anymore, and he had passed. Still, he held on until a boat came for them. They took Torreson on, but refused the boy, because there was no room for the dead. Early that morning, the grey skies loomed angrily over the borough of Brielle at the mouth of the Manasquan River, where the big 60-foot fishing boat Paramount rode at her moorings. Paramount had once been used to run bootlegged alcohol for gangster Dutch Schultz before it was seized by the government and sold to the Bogan family, Captain John Bogan and his two sons, Jimmy Bogan and John Jr. There didn't seem to be much point going out that day with the sea so wild, but then there came startling news from men on another boat. Somewhere out there was a liner burning. They quickly made preparations and set off into the murk. There was a job to be done. Morro Castle had once been a sparkling jewel in the Wardline fleet. She'd been designed and built at a time of great national difficulty, and she became something of a symbol for American technological prowess. But now she lay smouldering, twisted, and destroyed. Within the span of 2 hours, the ship had been completely consumed and hundreds had been set adrift in the vast Atlantic. She'd been just hours from home. Just a few miles north of Seagirt, New Jersey, and its red brick lighthouse, lies Asbury Park. Asbury Park is still a very popular resort town, and to this day, its crowning glory is its spectacular, stately convention centre. The convention hall was built in the late 1920s, right on the boardwalk. It heralded a golden age for the Jersey Shore, where thousands flocked for summer vacation at the beach. Pageants, parades, and events littered the summer calendar. Looming large over all of it was the gorgeous Beaux Arts Hall. But its most famous moment came in September 1934, when the hall, instead, became the backdrop to something bizarre and terrible. And it was here, just behind me, just over 90 years ago, that morning in 1934, the residents of Asbury Park, New Jersey, awoke to a truly incredible sight. There, grounded firmly on the sandy bottom, was the charred hulk of a once proud ocean liner. In full view of thousands of curious onlookers were all the buckled hull plates, row upon row of twisted and shattered portholes, the tough paint peeled and torn off. Disturbingly, in the davits sat boats designed to save human lives. Instead, they'd burned with the ship. One had even broken in half. The entire smoking palace of destruction had come to rest just off the convention hall's walkway. It was practically within touching distance. Hours earlier, all through the early morning of the 8th, the ship had burned uncontrollably before a small flotilla of rescue ships had arrived on station. Most notable among the fleet was the Paramount. Her brave crew had surged out into the chop in their boat, darting back and forth in a desperate attempt to pull as many people out of the water that they could. It was tough work, but they were driven on by the ragged and weary survivors they came across, some just clinging to life. They were guided at times by an airplane, with New Jersey Governor A. Harry Moore aboard. The pilot would dip his wing over the position of a body in the water. The Bogan family toiled hard for hours and eventually gathered around 67 people, dodging bodies in the water so they wouldn't damage them. The effort was heroic, but it made the Coast Guards look poor by contrast. For starters, the US Coast Guard didn't pick up the Morro Castle's distress call themselves. It had been relayed to them some time afterward, and it put them on the back foot right away. At 4:30 am, the cutter Tampa, moored at Staten Island, prepared to get underway, but she didn't make it to the scene until nearly 8 am, about the same time as the cutter Calhoun. And even then, she took up station to windward of the ship, away from where passengers might have been blown and drifted. Other Coast Guard ships weren't made aware of the unfolding disaster until the morning wore on. The fact was that there was no love lost between the fishermen of the Jersey coast and the Coast Guard themselves, who regularly searched their boats, and tensions ran high. The fishermen were quick to blame the Coast Guard and accuse them of cowardice and bungling, while the Coast Guard reports laid out a fantastical timeline that took most of the credit for the rescue. Eventually, all that could be done had been done. Survivors had been fished out of the water, sodden and miserable. Among them was Alma Hill. When a first fishing boat had passed her by, she almost gave up. But a half hour later, another came and dragged her aboard. She'd been in the water for hours, and her silver Elgin watch had stopped at around 4 am forever. After 8 hours in the water herself, Selma Filzer was found by the Paramount, but her new husband, Charles, was nowhere to be seen. This is the kind of tragic human drama that played out over hours as the little rescue boats did all that they could. Some survivors were missed. They had to make it ashore by themselves. The Gianninis had jumped off the stern at the last possible moment and been surrounded by darkness. But just piercing the suffocating black was a light. It was the sea-girt lighthouse, 12 or 13 miles away, and with a raging sea before it. But it gave the Gianninis hope. They swam and swam with all their might. When they got tired, they just stopped and floated together. Against all the odds, and for somewhere between 12 and 16 hours, this newlywed couple battled against the waves until they were bodily washed ashore on the beach in front of a group of spectators so dazed they didn't even react to help. Meanwhile, still aboard the ship was Captain William Worms and a small group of crew, including the radioman, Alanya, and Rogers. They'd seen 2 passengers off and then waited for rescue themselves, but the question soon arose of what to do about the massive ship. Worms stood on the bow after 24 punishing hours awake trying to negotiate a tow with a tugboat when the cutter Tampa had arrived on scene and offered the tow instead. Worms agreed and signalled in Morse code with a flashlight that he and his men would stay there until a line could be got aboard. Eventually they did it after considerable fuss and fighting. A 12-inch thick line was passed up to the men on the Morro Castle's bow so the ship, what was left of it, could be towed to safety. But now the men ran into a frustrating problem. Morro Castle's anchor had been dropped while the ship had drifted through the night. To raise it would require the use of the massive motorised windlass, except the ship now lay dead in the water, completely powerless. There was just one thing for it. Through the morning and the early afternoon, the remaining crew worked in shifts to saw through the 3-inch thick steel links with a hand hacksaw. The Tampa waited patiently. But then they got a horrifying report over the radio that other Coast Guard vessels, like small lifeboats, had still been patrolling and plucking people out of the water while Tampa had sat at anchor on the wrong side of the ship. As the anchor lines were cut through, people still washed ashore all up and down the Jersey coast, alive but haggard. Through the surf, they appeared like ghosts in tattered night clothes. Locals rushed to help and drag them ashore wherever they could before rushing them off to hospital in police cars, ambulances, and even private vehicles. Others opened up their homes to these unexpected, tragic guests and warmed them with blankets and hot coffee. The lifeboats came ashore in the thunderous surf too, tragically underloaded. A few of the lost rescue boats made a landing as well. But back in New York, crowds of people stood around, frustrated. They'd been waiting for their friends and loved ones to come back from the holiday of a lifetime at the Wardlines Pier, but no ship had materialised at 7 am as planned. The Morro Castle, it seemed, was missing. In fact, Morro Castle was not missing. The anchor had finally been let go around noon, and the chain roared and rattled out the hawser, freeing the ship. With the 600-foot-long cable attached and Paramount ready to begin towing the massive hulk, Worms and his men at last abandoned the vessel, clambering over the side in a rope ladder. But the boat they stepped into was draped with bodies of passengers who'd been fished dead from the sea. Worms was the last to leave. He'd tried to stay, but he'd been forced off, legend says, by a Coast Guardsman at gunpoint. As the boat pulled away, the group looked on in unbelieving horror at the ruined ship they had left still smoking behind them. The tiny cutter, Tampa, struggled forward with Morro Castle in tow, but it was like pulling an obstinate elephant with a golf cart. The seas took the big liner heaving this way and that, and for hours the sad convoy battled the worsening conditions, but by early afternoon the search and rescue mission had been suspended by the Coast Guard because the weather was just too severe. But meanwhile, Tampa was in a David and Goliath fight to bring the big liner in, but it was losing the fight. By early evening, the Morro Castle was beginning to drag Tampa in closer and closer to shore. In an effort to get the big ship back out to deeper water, Tampa throttled up hard, but the strain was too much. With a thunderous crack, like a cannon shot, the 12-inch line parted with enormous force. The cutter's engines died, and her skipper rushed to drop an anchor so she wouldn't wash ashore. The Tampa came to a halt, but Morro Castle was now left to the winds and the currents. So it was that Morro Castle came to rest directly out the front of Asbury Park's convention hall. It was supposed to be the end of the summer season, the time when the city's attractions eased, shops and businesses began to shutter their doors. Instead, from miles around, thousands flocked to come see this incredible, terrible sight. A charred ocean liner resting just feet from the shoreline in one of America's seaside playgrounds. The restaurants opened once again and advertised the best views of the ship. The Ferris wheel turned, packed with sightseers. Disaster tourism was in full swing. With the Morro Castle beached high and dry, and hundreds of thousands of people watching on incredulously, naturally, the question began to arise in the minds of the public and officials alike. What had happened? One of the first steps for the investigation was to step aboard the ship and explore her ruined remains. Now, getting aboard was not a simple task. A breeches buoy was run between ship and shore, connected to the handily placed exhibition hall. The party could haul themselves aboard safely and step onto the steel skeleton that was still hot to the touch. Once aboard, crews were greeted with a shocking sight. The ship was nearly unrecognisable. The elegant interior spaces had been completely gutted. The fire was so hot it melted bulkheads and beams and bent them into abstract shapes. Virtually every inch of deckwood had been consumed, leaving behind exposed deck beams with bolts that once would have secured the planks. It's almost impossible to imagine a way Morro Castle could have been more destroyed. But the same inferno that had bent steel like it was soggy paper had also spared haunting touches of humanity. Resting on a deck was a tray of food, perhaps room service, set down by a steward or passenger, with the charred remains of a pineapple still standing up on it. It was hoped that a thorough search of the ship might help give the answers that were so desperately needed. The first order of business was a cabin-to-cabin analysis. Not many people had been trapped in their staterooms. For most of Morro Castle's complement, the smoke or commotion had woken them up long before the fire had cut them off. The same could not be said for a few unfortunate souls on A deck. These were some of the finest staterooms on the ship, but they'd proved to be death traps when the fire had rushed up from B deck below and swept along the deck. In A3, where Miss Charlotte Cochrane had been asleep, molten jewellery, eyeglasses, and gold inlay teeth were found, then a few smoking bones still resting on her mattress springs. In A10, Max Berliner's cabin, cufflinks, wristwatches, all melted, gold teeth, and bones. A23, the stateroom Mrs. Caridad Sains had shared with her daughters, a jumble of scorched bones balanced on the deck beams, and the corridor outside, a human pelvis. In A16, Mrs. D'Orne's cabin, the skeleton of the whippet she'd had to abandon so quickly. Mixed into the ashes and detritus littering the floors of the rooms were all the effects, all the personal treasures that had been carefully packed and carted for an unforgettable holiday. Rings, thimbles, a penknife, cube and coins, medals, necklaces, pearls, engraved watches, crosses, almost anything that wasn't metal or bone had been eaten by fire, but these haunting touches of humanity remained. So thorough, so shocking was the destruction of the Morro Castle that little could be learned from its charred hulk. Any physical evidence of a possible cause for the fire was long gone. The palatial lounge with its elegant carvings and panels had been reduced to bare steel and existed only as a hole in the centre of the ship. It quickly earned the liner a slew of nicknames. Newsreels had once called her the Merchant Queen. Now they dubbed her the Ship of Death, the funeral ship. But if investigators were ever to get to the bottom of the tragedy, they'd need to look to the living, the survivors, the passengers and the crew who'd lived through the night and experienced the terror, felt the heat of the flames. And this is where things became difficult. The story, the events that happened, the characters involved, it all presented investigators with an incredibly complex web that had to be pieced apart bit by bit. The questions began to mount even as the ship's bedraggled survivors came to terms with what had just happened to them in hospital beds across the state. Investigators at the US Coast Guard had their work cut out for them. First and foremost was the cause of the blaze. Fires at sea were not infrequent in the days of steam when liners were covered in wood panelling and thick varnish. Back then, discarded cigarettes could be sucked back into open vents or portholes, igniting carpets and drapes. Many big passenger ships were lost this way from a simple moment of carelessness. But the uncomfortable fact was that the Morro Castle's fire seemed to have originated in the dead of night, with a storm raging up above and inside of a closed cabinet. It was the perfect storm. The fire doors hadn't been closed. The ship's course had been maintained long enough for the flames to take complete control of the vessel. And then there was her captain, Wilmont. He'd died suddenly, unexpectedly, on the last night, and command had fallen to his chief, William Worms. The radiomen gave their stories, with Chief Operator George Rogers being hailed a hero of the disaster. But in the event, a single, vague distress call had gone out at the 11th hour, and even then, only just. Only 5 passengers had left Morro Castle in one of the ship's lifeboats. The rest of the boats that launched were full of crew instead. In the end, counts showed that at least 124 of Morro Castle's complement had died. The alcohol, weapons and drug running, the political ties, the communist threat, the people smuggling. The serious issues with the story were disturbing as the image of the burnt-out ship itself. In many ways, this was just the start of the Morro Castle saga because the horrible truths uncovered and then buried by the investigations to come shock even to this day. They'd lead to prison sentences, conspiracy, and murder. Understanding this complex web is no easy task today, let alone back in 1934 when it had first happened. To help pull the mystery apart, I travelled to Asbury Park, where Morro Castle washed up that September, and met with author, researcher and presenter Caitlin Doughty. Caitlin has dedicated her career to charting death practices around the world, serving as a mortician and advocating for funeral industry reform. She's currently working on an upcoming book detailing the work undertaken to retrieve Titanic's dead in 1912, and her research on that subject has given her unique knowledge in the subject of death at sea. We met in the shadow of the Asbury Park Convention Hall, where 90 years ago, just a few hundred feet away from us, the ship had sat smoking and ruined.
90 years ago, what would this beach have been like?
Just a macabre spectacle. Hundreds of thousands of people on this beach, and out in front of them, which they had no context for, this beached ocean liner, which was described as a smoldering coffin.
For those watching on, it would have been impossible to comprehend the nightmare the ship's passengers had endured, but as survivors gave statements, it began to paint a picture for investigators of true horror. They had to wind the clock back to understand the full magnitude of what had happened. It all began the evening of the 7th of September, just hours before the fire broke out, when Captain Wilmont had retired to his cabin early, complaining of stomach pain, and suddenly, unexpectedly, died.
When you think about it, people were dying on ocean liners all the time, right? But the death of a captain was really different. And yes, they still had to get all these passengers back to New York safely, but the big final dance was canceled. There wasn't as much drinking. All the public music was shut down because this funereal pall had fallen over everything. And there really was a different vibe entirely on the Morro Castle after the captain died.
With Wilmot's passing, command passed on to Chief Officer William Worms. but only because he had demanded the responsibility. His first task had been to deal with his dead predecessor.
So what did they do with the captain's body?
There's an account from a steward who said he cleaned, dressed, and laid out the captain's body in his bed in his cabin. However, keep in mind, there's starting to be rumors circulating that his death might not have been entirely natural. And so they're trying to balance showing honor to their captain while at the same time realizing that there's probably going to be some sort of forensic investigation that happens once they reach New York.
With the captain's body locked in his cabin, Worms turned his attention to getting his ship back to New York. For passengers, Wilmot's death was a sudden shock. He was a people pleaser through and through, and he'd do anything for his passengers. But beneath the veneer of confidence was a man stressed to his limit, because the ship under his command was deeply, deeply unhappy. Almost as soon as the dawn sun had revealed Morro Castle's charred hulk resting on the sand, movements were made for a hurried inquiry. The chief concern among investigators is that all the witnesses and survivors of disasters like this can disperse and scatter across the country and the world. They had to move quickly to get the truth out of them. Just 2 days after the fire, September 10th, 1934, it began. A panel was put together made of experts. For one, there was Carl C. Nielsen, a captain and district inspector of the Steamboat Inspection Service, who'd probed the sinking of the liner Vestris back in 1929. 2 other inspectors joined him, James Smith and John Crone, but overseeing all of it was Assistant Director of the Bureau of Navigation, Dickerson Hoover. This group of experienced professionals got to work hearing testimony and heart-wrenching tales of survival and death in New York, and the picture that witnesses painted was a disturbing one. It became obvious that Morro Castle's crew were badly underpaid and highly undisciplined. Because wages were so poor, crewmen supplemented their income by smuggling all kinds of contraband into the States from Cuba. Rum, marijuana, and concerningly, heroin apparently all found their way aboard. Discipline was so poor, the crew had taken to sleeping in unoccupied passenger cabins, a strange practice that would have been strongly discouraged in other lines, but it seems Wardline treated its crews with indifference. Testimony from Wardline's seamen and officers showed a picture of serious discontent and a captain straining to keep it all together as one cohesive unit. It had come to a head just weeks before his death and the fatal fire. On August 27, the ship had been off the Florida coast when an alarm sounded. Fire had broken out in a cargo hold down in the bowels of the hull. More than 60 bundles of cardboard and paper had erupted into flames that were doused and put out just before they could set the cargo around them on fire too. Most worrying of all was the crew's reaction, a bungled event that had nearly seen the ship burn in its entirety. In a letter to a friend, Wilmot said it had given him a jolt, and when investigators began to turn up more facts, it soon became clear why. For one, Morro Castle was sailing regularly into an increasingly hostile port. Cuba had been in the grips of revolutionary spirit for some time, and by 1934 things were getting dire. Communist sympathizers and anarchists rallied furiously, and the image of Imperial America was distasteful to the most patriotic of Cuban hearts. The American relationship with Cuba had always been testy at best. In February 1898, the battleship USS Maine had been anchored in Havana harbor during the Cuban War of Independence when it erupted into a massive explosion. The disaster partly drove America to war with Spain when it was announced that Spanish sabotage had been the culprit. The truth was that no evidence of sabotage existed whatsoever, and the blast was most likely just an accident. But in the struggle of major powers like America and Spain, Cuba had acted largely like the rope in a game of tug-of-war. As the spirit of Cuban independence began to burn, some passionate reactionaries turned to violence. There were bombings across the country, even as Wardline's liners had carried shiploads of happy tourists into Havana to visit what had been billed as a fun, tropical escape. The shore visits had to be carefully curated to avoid the worst of the truth, that Cuba was a country on the verge of something immense. It resulted in uncomfortable scenes. Once, refugees had demanded asylum right there on the docks as Morro Castle's shocked passengers had been boarding to return home. Some passengers were mugged on Havana's streets on their visits. There had been riots, demonstrations, and then the worst had happened. As Morro Castle was about to leave on one of her routine return voyages from Havana, she was even shot at by rebels. To some of those that fought for their nation's independence, Morro Castle and her sister Oriente might have stood as symbols of arrogant imperialism. This was the kind of toxic environment Morro Castle steamed into every week, and Captain Wilmont had been warned personally by the chief of the city's police to be very careful of communist agitators and possible sabotage. In his report on the August fire, Wilmot dismissed the seriousness of the event and suggested it was an errant cigarette that had just started the blaze. But his mind must have darted between any number of possible causes, and in the privacy of his cabin it's not hard to imagine paranoia setting in at the thought of Cuban rebels sneaking aboard and setting fire to his beautiful ship. But less than a month after the small fire in the cargo hold, Morro Castle had burned completely. So concerning was the threat of communist sabotage that the FBI immediately sprang to work interviewing survivors and compiling top-secret files on key crew members and more. Their findings showed the true depth of unhappiness aboard the ship, and even cast doubt on the nature of Wilmot's death. Captain Wilmot's crew were largely a surly lot, unhappy with their pay to be sure, but the environment they worked in, the culture on board, was simply rotten. Living conditions aboard the ship were very poor, the food nearly rancid. Shore leave was frequently cancelled. Chief Officer William Worms had long wanted his own command, but now he was aging and regularly overlooked. Even when Captain Wilmot was away, command passed to skippers from other ships. He was disliked by many who feared that he was a weak leader, but possibly most of all by Chief Engineer Eben Abbott. The rivalries and the politics started at the top and worked their way down the hierarchical chain. One of the notable troublemakers had been young radio man George Alanya. For one thing, there had been rumours that he was a communist sympathiser, something that put him on Captain Wilmot's radar to begin with. Worst of all though, Alanya had been surprised at the poor state of crew conditions aboard Morro Castle and actively spoke out against it, stirring up discontent among the crew and building support for a strike. The problem was that Captain Wilmot couldn't do anything about the radio man. He was not employed by Wardline, but the Radio Marine Corporation of America. Wilmot was stuck with Alanya until the corporation could send Wardline a replacement. Alanya may have been a troublemaker, but he was far from being the most disliked man in the radio room. Working alongside him was the chief operator, George Rogers. Rogers was a tall, unattractive character who made people around him generally feel uncomfortable. A leering, strange man with an odd sense of humour. He took his seat before the inquiry committee and painted a picture of heroism. He said he'd been awakened 20 minutes after fire had broken out, that already smoke was beginning to pour into the wireless room and sting his eyes. He said that he'd sent Alanya to go get orders from the bridge, and waited because wireless regulations were strict and he needed the captain's okay. Because he waited so long and finally got the message sent at the last moment, Rogers and Alanya were some of the handful of crew who stayed on the ship all night. Rogers said he'd even tried to jump into the ocean to save a female passenger, but he was stopped by Captain Worms, who feared for his safety. In his own testimony, Rogers called Alanya, his assistant, a troublemaker who tried to stage the strike over bad conditions on board. In fact, Rogers began to paint Alanya out to be a possible suspect. He told the committee that well before the fire, Captain Wilmot had conferred with Rogers and asked, "What's the matter with Alanya? Is he crazy? I don't trust that man." Rogers had written letters accusing Alanya of staging walkouts and agitation that bordered on a kind of communist mutiny. He even said he'd found questionable material in Alanya's locker, components to make a kind of chemical bomb. It was a compelling story, one the press ran with. The picture of the dashing radio man urgently sending out a distress call was one the public was used to and enjoyed. They'd seen heroes like this emerge from the Titanic, the Empress of Ireland, Lusitania, and other disasters. But Rogers' distress call had been anything but urgent. The truth was that George Rogers was far from being the long-suffering hero of the Morro Castle that the media painted him out to be. The ship's crew were badly disciplined, but Rogers was something else. He was a troublemaker, somebody who toys with people for his own pleasure. He had pitted his junior radiomen against one another and stirred them up pitilessly. His conferences with Captain Wilmot added badly to the old man's stress. Rogers told wild tales of death threats and sabotage and confirmed the captain's worst fears. He wrote letter after letter indicting his fellow crewmen of plots to take the captain down or the ship. The most disturbing of all had been his behaviour the night of the fire. His fellow radioman remarked, on his coolness, his unusual levity, that even as the flames licked at the wireless room's porthole, Rogers remained composed, almost cheerful. In the end, the inquiry found that he was the hero he had painted himself out to be. He went on stage and radio shows billed as Sparks Rogers and opened his own radio shop, but investigators had failed to look into his dark past. It would all come out years later at a trial for murder. With the investigators beginning to get a clearer picture of the strange conditions aboard Morro Castle, they turned their attention to Captain Wilmont himself. The rumour had been that he had been poisoned by an unhappy crew member. The night of the fire, Wilmont had retired early to his cabin, complained of stomach pain, and then suddenly died. The ship's doctor, Van Zyl, had concluded it was a heart attack, so had 3 passenger doctors aboard too, but Van Zyl could never give his testimony because he'd died in the disaster that followed. To get to the bottom of it, all eyes turned to the mangled wreck of the still smoking ship, because aboard her, somewhere, was what remained of her once beloved captain, and the critical evidence that might prove if his death, and the resulting fire, had been an intentional act.
There's an incredible account from the Asbury Park chief of fire of finding Captain Wilmot's body, and it was in his cabin, but the fire and the heat was so intense that the legs of his bed had actually melted and his body has slid down. And body is a bit of a strong term here. It was essentially a set of charred bones and ashes.
Well then, given what was left behind, were they even able to determine if there had been foul play involved?
They really thought there was a chance that they could, which is why, even though the body was in the state that it was in, they decided to collect it and bring it in and have it autopsied, believing that either chemists or toxicologists might be able to see if there was, for instance, poison in his system. They didn't find any poison in his system. What they did find was traces of lead and copper because of the high heat and metals in his cabin.
So is this any conclusive proof that he was or wasn't poisoned?
Here's the thing, we can't say that with 100% certainty. We discovered in our research that the man who actually performed the toxicology test was a man named Alexander Gettler, who was the guy in this field. He was the father of forensic toxicology. But when you have someone at the cutting edge of this technology, there's still so much more to go and more to learn and tests to devise and technology to develop. So in the 1930s, did they have what was needed to test for the poison that was in his system? That's unclear. We can never really know with complete certainty if he was poisoned or not.
Wilmot's death was one thing. The fire that engulfed his ship was another thing entirely. Even as the inquiry committee met day by day through September, victims of the ship washed up ashore. As stories from passengers and crew began to clarify the frantic, sudden events of the night, the discovery at the stern of the ship told of a tragic fight for survival. There, scattered on the after decks, were clothes, belts, trousers, shoes, all hastily discarded as passengers made the decision to stay behind or leap into the unknown.
It sounds like the passengers and crew of the Morro Castle who were left on board had very few choices available.
Well, I think a steward said that for passengers, the choice was burn or jump, meaning there was this inferno of fire behind you. It's actually very similar to what I think people experienced during 9/11 in the towers, where behind you is a wall of fire and in front of you is a jump that will very likely lead to your death. So it's sort of choosing between two deaths. And this existential option was so intense for some passengers that they waited a very long time. And there are accounts of women waiting so long on the deck of Morro Castle that they inhaled smoke to the point that when they finally jumped into the water, they didn't have the strength to survive the time they needed to spend there.
The rescue efforts had been ragtag but dedicated, with volunteers coming from far and wide to help where they could. Notable among them were the Bogan family aboard their boat, Paramount.
There's a story of a family who brought their fishing boat out to rescue people just of their own volition, and they did. They rescued 67 people. But they describe again and again coming upon these clumps of people in the water, and one of the family members has died. And they're telling the living people, you have to let this person go, let them float away, someone else will pick them up. There's only room for living people in this boat. But it was so difficult for them to give up the corpse of their family member, to just leave it behind in the water. And you can understand that. I don't know what I would do if I was in that same situation.
For those who made it off the ship but died in the water, what happened to these people?
The bodies in the water scattered all the way down this beach. Some of them washed up on shore, half dead, half alive, and they worked on them with these machines called pulmotors, which were some early respiratory machines that pumped oxygen into their lungs. And some people could be saved that way. Because of the current, bodies washed south of here, and there was a 10-mile stretch that they were washing up. And one policeman said that you could not go a mile in this stretch without finding 1 or 2 bodies of the victims. And because of the grim nature of this tragedy, sometimes burned body parts of the victims.
With dozens of bodies to contend with, the overwhelmed constabulary rushed to catalogue and house the dead.
The bodies that they recovered, they took to several temporary morgues, the largest of which was the Seagirt National Guard Training Center. The families would come and walk into these large rooms lined with identical cots, bodies under identical white sheets. And you would walk along and the body would be revealed to you. And it was absolutely horrifying to think of finding your dead loved one, but at a certain point it became even worse to think that you wouldn't find your dead loved one because that would mean they were missing. In these temporary morgues, they would also embalm the bodies, which was extremely important to preserve the dead bodies after the level of fire and the time in the water that they experienced in order to transport them either within the country or out of the country for burial.
There were over 110 victims of the fire recovered. Among them was the honeymooner Charles Filzer. His wife Selma had been pulled alive from the water, but the handsome businessman had been washed away. They'd only been married 8 days. Dr. Joseph Bregstein had taken his young son Mervyn on the voyage to soften the blow that he intended to marry again following the death of his wife, Mervyn's mother. Then had come the fire. Father and son had rushed up on deck and leapt over the side with sisters Gladys and Ethel Knight. The heavy seas had driven the little group apart. Joseph was picked up by a boat from Monarch of Bermuda, but he had no news of the sisters or his son. Eventually, he found Ethel and Gladys, but learned they'd lost Mervyn in the swell. The lad had been taken by the ocean, and he was never found. Franz de Besch was a 6'4" Cuban swimmer, just 18 years old. He'd given his life jacket away and leapt over the side of the burning ship. If anybody stood a chance at surviving the night, then it was him. But he was exhausted, last seen speaking with a woman in the water. He was pulled out to sea and never seen again. Nearly 10 other victims of the disaster were never found. In the end, the inquiry found that the disaster had been the result of negligence, that all but one deck officer and 2 of her senior engineers had handled the ship poorly and failed to coordinate an effective evacuation. The ship's construction, design, and fire prevention technology was found to be modern and completely satisfactory, but that the alarm itself was ineffective and the escapes had not been properly marked out. The report stated officers had waited too long to send the SOS, that the fire, which had broken out inside of a closed cupboard, was of an unknown origin, an act of God, but that it should have been contained and dealt with far easier than it had been. Acting Captain Worms was indicted for negligence. So was Chief Engineer Eben Abbott and Wardline's Vice President Henry Cabot. They were all sent to prison, but in the end an appeal released them because there was a far more obvious scapegoat. Captain Wilmont was a people pleaser who'd had fire hydrants capped so passengers wouldn't slip on them, but he'd failed to act decisively following the earlier fire in the cargo hold, and had done a poor job of managing his almost delinquent crew. The story passed from the headlines, and the world moved on. Rogers did his stage and radio shows, and was still hailed the hero of the tragedy. It had taken a full week for the fire to die out aboard the ship, and Asbury Park had enjoyed the lucrative tourist trade. But then, many of the tourists had gone home, and all that remained was the nauseating stench of burning hides and the ghastly charred wreck. In March 1935, the towering hulk of the ship was at last dislodged from the Asbury Park beach and towed to Baltimore, where she was broken up for scrap. The case, it seemed, was closed. But then, in 1953, nearly 20 years after the Morro Castle burned, George Rogers, the hero of the story, was arrested for double homicide. William Hummel was a 71-year-old friend of Rogers who lived at home with his daughter Edith. One day, after Rogers had driven him out to the bank, William and Edith had disappeared. A search of the home days later found them both dead and decomposing with horrible wounds to the head, clearly blunt force trauma. Rogers was arrested and charged with the murder, and suddenly a torrent of information came out about the man who had once worked to save the passengers and crew of Morro Castle. In 1949, William Hummel had written a note that said, "It may have been unwise on my part to continually advance him money, but said Rogers is very temperamental, and I was in constant fear." Rogers was deeply in debt to Hummel. He'd killed him to wipe out the loans. But this was far from Rogers' first brush with the law. His criminal record, dating back to well before he joined Morro Castle, makes for sobering reading. George Rogers was born in 1901 in New York, and from a young age, when he had lost both his parents, he displayed troubling behaviour. It had started with petty theft, and he was soon expelled a handful of times from various schools. He had a penchant for starting fires, and then, at age 15, he committed a violent sexual assault. A stint in the Navy saw him learn his trade as a radioman before he was discharged and went to work with the wireless EGERT company. Soon, he quickly left the company's employ, though, because they suspected him of starting a fire. That was in 1929, just 5 years before the Morro Castle. He had married Edith Edmondson in 1923, and then once poisoned and killed her pet dog because she had attended the funeral of a cousin he had wanted her to avoid. He had faked break-ins on past employers to steal their electrical equipment. This was the man who was hired by the Radiomarine Corporation of America and placed aboard the SS Morro Castle. At the inquiry, Rogers had painted out his subordinate, George Alanya, to be a troublemaking communist and a source of antagonism on the ship. But maybe, just maybe, it had been Rogers all along, colluding with different crewmen, whispering into the captain's ear and stirring the pot to create a perpetual sense of suspicion and dread aboard. For Alanya, it had been a professional death knell. The 28-year-old was unable to find any employment afterward because his name was linked inextricably with the so-called death ship. Rogers had started his own radio shop in his local Bayonne, New Jersey, but that too caught fire and burnt down, never mind the fact it had been struggling to turn a profit. He was still a kind of local hero though, and was picked up by the Bayonne Police Department to work in their radio room. He soon befriended Police Lieutenant Vincent Doyle, a proponent of radio systems in police communication. Once, the two had been casually chatting when the Morro Castle came up. Rogers outlined an unusually specific, detailed account of how he might go about setting a fire like that. That he'd fill up a fountain pen with 2 dangerous acids that, when mixed, react violently and heat exponentially. That a small copper separating piece could be slowly dissolved and act like a kind of timer until it failed and the mixture ignited. Doyle was taken aback and began to suspect that the suggestion wasn't hypothetical at all, that he might have just heard a confession. Shortly afterward, in 1938, Doyle received a package in the post, a fish tank heater that needed repair. He was an electronics enthusiast and sometimes tinkered with broken machinery, so he opened the box, plugged the heater into the wall, and then a violent explosion blew out windows in the workshop and nearly shook the building apart. But Doyle survived, though his hand and his leg had been badly injured. He'd need to walk with a cane the rest of his life, but the most shocking result of the explosion was the investigation. It found that the heater had been packed with TNT and that Rogers had set it. He was sentenced to up to 20 years for attempted murder, and at last this repeat offender was safely behind bars. But then fate intervened, and this is where the story becomes murky. George Rogers only served a few years before his release under a program that sought to set free first-time offenders if they were willing to volunteer for service on the home front against Nazi Germany and Japan. Remarkably, his parole request was approved, and he went to work at an aircraft factory and eventually became a foreman. When the war was over, Rogers did electrical odd jobs around Bayonne and became something of a town oddity, a kind of bombastic eccentric who would waste no time in holding a listener captive and explaining his many fantastical tales. Then, in 1953, came his final arrest, the double murder of William and Edith Hummel. One of the investigators was a man who walked with a limp and leant on a cane, Lieutenant Vincent Doyle. He wrote to Edith, Rogers' wife of 30 years, saying, "You have my deepest sympathy. I have known for many years that your husband broke the hearts of both your mother and father. He alienated your brother, Bill. He killed your dog because he went to the funeral of a cousin when he told you not to. He killed the captain of the Morro Castle before he set fire to the ship, killing 134 more people. But for the intervention of divine providence, he would have killed me. He killed your friends, the Hummels, and spent the money which he robbed from Bill Hummel's dead body. You're right when you say he deserves no sympathy." Rogers was at last sentenced to life imprisonment. He spent his days fixing radio equipment at New Jersey State Prison. He died just 5 years later, in 1958, taking whatever secrets remained with him. For 90 long years, authors and researchers have argued long and hard about Rogers' involvement in the disaster. His presence is undeniably a disturbing one, a man dubbed a career criminal since his teens and an expert in electricity and fire. But probably most disturbing of all is the status of his files as they rest with the US government. In 1985, an effort was made by researchers Robert McDonnell and Frederick Rasmussen to unseal his papers under the Freedom of Information Act, but a court ruling in 1993 set a bizarre series of precedents. The Rogers juvenile records from 1911 to 1922 remained sealed, and that the national security exemptions meant other records remained entirely closed off. FBI files on Rogers are heavily redacted, and some are nearly illegible. The researchers found that the FBI had investigated Rogers more heavily than any other person aboard the ship that night, dedicating hundreds of man-hours, and that his past, with all of its disturbing records, had to have been known about, but that it was never acted on, and most of the FBI's findings from way back in the 1930s have remained redacted and sealed to this day. It points to an unusual possibility, that Rogers might have served as an FBI informant on communist activity, or even an intelligence operative during the Second World War. The researchers' conclusions were that the US government, as far as George Rogers is concerned, is withholding something of a national embarrassment. The actual cause or reason for the fire has never been definitively explained. One theory went that the Ward Line, mired in the aftermath of the Depression and aware of the brewing troubles in Cuba, had engaged Rogers to burn the ship down on purpose to collect on the insurance. This seems unlikely. Another theory has pointed out the fire's origins as being close to the ship's funnel uptakes, that the heated uptakes, hundreds of degrees in temperature, might have been overheated by the intense winds of the storm, that a single failing section of insulation could see that the heat would be conducted directly to the panelling from behind. Assistant purser Tom Torreson had survived the night narrowly, but spent the rest of his life collecting news clippings and information on the fire. For his part, he bitterly disagreed that the Ward Line had burnt their own ship down for insurance. The inquiry had found that Acting Captain Worms and Officer Clarence Hackney had failed to shut the fire doors, but Torreson was glad they didn't, saying if they had, hundreds of passengers and crew would have been trapped. Torreson spent his years correcting mistakes in articles and newspapers, providing the facts as he had studied them and knew them from his own experience. He battled misinformation as best he could. When one paper suggested Captain Wilmont had capped every fire hydrant, Torreson pointed out that only one, on the B-deck portside promenade, had been capped, purely because it leaked.
Acting Captain Worms, in command when the ship caught fire, is escorted to the Board of Inquiry.
What do you think was the cause of the fire? Was it cigarettes? Perhaps. Probably not. Was it lightning? No. Incendiarism? Probably. As far as you know, were all the passengers notified of the fire? Yes. Captain, how do you account for reports that of the lifeboat used, most of them contained members of the crew? The crew is assigned to the lifeboats to operate them. Were the lifeboats in workable condition? Absolutely.
9 decades since Morro Castle caught fire and washed ashore, the facts of the case have been diluted into that dreaded word, conspiracy. Rogers is indicted and held to account in the public eye, and it seems like his many crimes have finally caught up with him. That dreadful night in 1934 is still etched in the mind of New Jersey residents, even though now it's just outside of living memory. We'll probably never know what really happened the night Morro Castle burned. Even the integrity of the inquiry is called into doubt. Dickerson N. Hoover, the chief of the committee, was the brother of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The inquiry found the Morro Castle's construction to be absolutely blameless, yet it failed to even call into question the heavily varnished wood panels that fed the voracious flames. At the backside of the panels featured deep channels that interconnected across virtually all of the bulkheads and meant flame could speed, unseen, from room to room without anybody even realizing. At least one person did pay attention: William Francis Gibbs, the aspiring naval architect. The image of the Morro Castle, tattered and blackened on the New Jersey beach, disturbed him so greatly that he vowed to design every ship he could to be as fireproof as practically possible. His magnum opus, the SS United States, was designed to feature no wood at all and boasted dozens and dozens of dedicated fire stations. Gibbs was dismayed to learn that the ship's piano had to be made of wood. He insisted it be made of fire-resistant mahogany, and he test-housed a section of material with gasoline and set it alight to make sure it wouldn't fully burn. But even so, the piano was surrounded by bare steel, fire-resistant furniture, and sheets of concealed asbestos. The Morro Castle's legacy on ship design was palpable. Asbestos companies even used it in their advertising. But the lessons still weren't fully digested. 30 years after Morro Castle burned, the cruise ship Laconia was lost in shockingly similar circumstances. Then, so too, the Yarmouth Castle. Rules and regulations became relaxed and crews became complacent. One crewman on Laconia in 1963 remembered he was trying to combat the blaze with a fire extinguisher that was dated from when the ship had been first fitted out all the way back in 1929. Today, strict rules dictate that wood panelling, the kind found on ships like Morro Castle, cannot be used at all, and that rooms are fitted with sprinklers throughout. But just as Morro Castle's legacy can still be felt in ship design today, so too it can be felt in Cuba, the nation it had so often visited. A shocked Cuban public mourned the ship, which had been a familiar sight in Havana, all the more because she'd been carrying Cuban passengers aboard. Franz de Besche, the young swimmer, became a local hero. A stadium was built in his honour. The popular vocal group, Trio Matamoros, composed the song El Desastre de Morro Castle in 1934, and it became a popular folk song in the Latin world. Today, if you want to see what remains of the Morro Castle, you need to visit the New Jersey Maritime Museum at Beach Haven, which holds a spectacular collection of carefully curated photos, films, and even artifacts, which hauntingly include passenger life jackets, life preservers, and even Alma Hill's silver Elgin watch. Stacked neatly in shelves against the walls are dozens of red binder folders containing thousands of pages of documents, including copies of the heavily redacted FBI files. The museum has been the pet project of historian and author Deborah Whitcraft, who's collected anything from the ship that she can get her hands on, and the collection today exists as the most complete assembly of Morro Castle paraphernalia probably in the world. Together with fellow researcher Gretchen Coyle, Deborah wrote Inferno at Sea, Stories of Death and Survival Aboard Morro Castle, which this video has been partly based on. It focuses on the human stories from the night and includes dozens of accounts which never made it into the public record until the book was published. Just outside the museum, waves gently lap on a sandy seashore, one of the most enchanting coastlines in the world, where Victorian homesteads and hotels rest easily by the Atlantic. It's hard to imagine the same spot 90 years ago, when a burning ocean liner lit up the night sky like a flare. The Morro Castle had been the darling of US shipbuilding, but her loss changed hundreds, even thousands of lives, and continues to intrigue us to this day. In a letter to Alma Hill, Raymond Egan, The Reverend, who'd been hailed as a hero, summed survivor attitudes up best when he said, "I know that you must feel the same about mentioning the accident as I do. The sooner we can forget, the better." The ship's passengers and crew wanted to move on with their lives and not live them out as just survivors or heroes. Today, Morro Castle really is all but forgotten about, an oddity in New Jersey's history, a curiosity for an online article or occasional social media post. But for decades, those left behind by the disaster had to live with its looming shadow. Young Bobby Gonzalez had died in the tragedy. Years and years later, his younger sister, Pepita, by then 83, remembered the young boy who loved to dance as vividly as if he were still alive. "I adored him," she said. "I loved him, and we always prayed for him. My mother never got over Bobby. She wore black the rest of her life. She never smiled again."